Now, for today, I have put up an outline just to kind of like give you an idea of what we're going to cover today and tomorrow. So for today, we're just going to do that meet and greet, which is I have met you and I've greeted you. And then I will talk more about the overview of, the research on organogram. And I have also decided to do some brief comparison between qualitative and quantitative research. I am going to use a worked example from one of my research projects, and I will use that to kind of like bring home the point of what I'm describing, and then I would answer one of the very important questions that everyone keeps asking. What about the generalization of findings? Because, qualitative research is too small. How are you going to generalize your findings? And that's for today. Now for tomorrow, like I mentioned, I don't know how practical this is going to be, but it's something we can obviously discuss and see how feasible it is. But I'm hoping that one of the highlights of tomorrow will be for us to be able to design a small scale study in groups, working online together to kind of like come up with a few questions and go about how are we going to be able to do it? What questions do we need to ask? How are we going to answer these questions? Just to, again, synthesize what we've talked about today. But if at the end of today, I realize it is not going to be feasible to have this, then by all means, we can talk more on additional methods with respect to qualitative research. So now, speaking of the overview, the research organogram, now in deciding on the design of your project, if you want to do a research project, the first thing you have to do is to ask yourself, why do I want to do this? So we start with what is technically called research question. Now, every time you want to do a research project, you should have a research question. What do you want to know? Why do you want to know it? So we start with that. Now, if you think of it broadly, that research question is going to determine how you answer the question. So the method you use to answer your question will be dependent on the type of question you want to ask. So I have put up here an organogram with visual that I would like to walk through with you. And this is very specific to qualitative research. So, excuse me for a minute, please. I can share it. I can't see the share again. Okay. What can you see? It's back again to, let me see. Okay. No. Auntie Grace, can you see? What can you see? Okay, right. Apologies for that. I just got the information about my presentation, so I'm hoping that it's better now. Is it better now?
Yes, please. I think
Okay.
the bigger now.
All right. Okay. So basically, I was going to walk you through the organogram, and like I mentioned, for you to be able to start a research, before you start any research project, you want to decide what question you want to answer. So I am going to use these to walk through a qualitative research, what it will look like typically if you want to do a research project. So we start first with the research design. Now, when we talk about research design, in simple terms, it is about the fundamental questions that needs to go into the methodology of what you want to do. So think of this organogram as your roadmap for all the questions you want to answer. So many of you may be familiar with the term longitudinal study. How many times are you going to collect data? Now, for longitudinal study, usually in quantitative research, that's the number of times to collect data from somebody. And cross-sectional also, it's the number of times. So sometimes you do it several times, sometimes you do it once. So for the research design, it's exactly the same thing in qualitative studies. So you want to decide how many times am I going to have contact with my study participant. So for example, I have used the cross-sectional qualitative study. In other words, you collect data from your participant once. You have one contact with them. And the same principle apply in qualitative research. So you might either collect data one time, you just do the one-time interview, or you could collect interview data across multiple time points. Again, that would be like longitudinal qualitative study. It's exactly the same principle. Now, in terms of the research strategy, when we talk about research strategy in qualitative research, it is usually inductive. Now, when we say inductive, it means it's from the ground up. We are finding the information to build the structure. Unlike quantitative research, where the research strategy is deductive, so we have this big overview and then we reduce it. For research strategy in qualitative research, it is inductive in that we build up from the ground up. Now, in terms of the research approach here, this is how are we going to collect the data. So qualitative in this context refers to texts, words, pictures, maps. These are all the ways by which we are going to collect data. It is qualitative and it is not quantity. In other words, it is not numbers. So that's the approach in terms of qualitative research. And then you talk about paradigm. Now, paradigm is something that it's quite confusing for a lot of people because it is based on a set of beliefs and actions that would guide the process of collecting data, of answering that research question. Now, for people that are very, another way to look at paradigm is philosophical position. So what's the philosophy? How would you know? What's the logic that you're using to inform the way you are asking your questions? So for some people that are very familiar with the idea of paradigm, it could be, an example would be positivism. So positivist paradigm is this absolute truth. We need to have that's how we know what we know. Now, in qualitative research, if you think of a paradigm as a continuum, we have at the end of that continuum is interpretivism, which is an interpretivist paradigm. So we want to know how we know what we know. I am going to talk more about that in my next slide in terms of the paradigms. And then we go on to talk about the methods of collecting data. Now, for qualitative research, there are several methods for collecting data. So we think of the individual data, we think of individual interviews. We also think of the focus groups, where you collect data from a lot of people at once. You think of, case studies. These are all methods for collecting the data. I'm sure you can see that it's not just one thing. It is several things that goes into answering this research question. A similar organogram can also be developed for quantitative study, but I have just, as a brief summary, provided this for the qualitative study. Now, of course, as part of the research method, we also talk about how to analyze the data. Some of you may be familiar with using SPSS for quantitative research, but in qualitative research, we don't usually use number counting software. There are software, of course, that we can also touch on depending on if you have time. But an approach to analyzing qualitative data is thematic analysis, there's framework analysis, there are several methods of analyzing data we collect from qualitative research. So I just want to have a very quick comparison and discussion with respect to qualitative versus quantitative strategies. And I have tried to make it simple, and then of course I will go through to explain. So if you think of the perception of the subject matter, in other words, if you think of the approach to the person that it's the point of data collection here. So we in quantitative research is very reductionistic. You identify and then you define the specific variables, and that's it. You collect that data, that number, to actually answer that question. Whereas in qualitative research is very holistic, because most of the time we want to consider the person in the context of their social environment. Now, another thing that I also want to point out in terms of the strategy is the positioning of the researcher. Now, in quantitative research, it is very objective. The researcher is detached from the process as much as possible. So this is described as the detached observation and precise measurement of variables. You have a questionnaire, you give it to people. The researcher is not involved as much as possible. If they need you to explain something to them, you can explain. Oftentimes, you don't have to explain. So you just give them, they give you the number, they give you the answer to your questionnaire, that's it. Whereas for qualitative research, there is a very close observation. In other words, there's a very close personal interaction with participants. If you're doing the qualitative interview, chances are you're going to sit with that person to ask them the information that you want to ask from them. Or even if it's a focus group that you're conducting with several people, there is going to still be that close interaction with your study participant. Now, in terms of the database or handling the data you collect, we are looking in quantitative research, we are looking for interrelationship among specific variables. So you want to look at your cross-sectional, your correlations and regression models. How does age affect, schooling, or how does age affect growth? You have that. Whereas for the quantitative aspect, it's more focused on descriptions of actions and related personal meanings within the context. So there is something very contextual with respect to data that you collect and how you actually handle that data. Now, another aspect of research overall that we have to bear in mind is theories, right? So theoretical positions. Now, for quantitative research, we have a normative approach to theory, which is that there are general propositions that try to explain causal relationships among variables. So how does A affect B? Very simple. You have the data, you have your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is testing whether variable A have an impact on variable D, and it's very clear you have that theory to explain it. Whereas for qualitative research, it is more interpretive in that we provide insight into the nature and social context of the personal meaning that each of these participants have added to the data. So at the end of the day, you have a data that you've collected that you want to synthesize. So you're not able to specifically talk about that one person, as opposed to when you just have the numbers that you're using to actually answer a very specific hypothesis. So the way to conceptualize this is for qualitative research, you're answering a question. Whereas most of the time, In quantitative research, you're testing an hypothesis. So those are very distinct approaches that you can use to help you remember how to go about doing qualitative research. Now, another thing to bear in mind is when we want to test for theory. So it's very controlled. In quantitative research, it's very controlled, is empirically supporting, and you, like I mentioned just now, you use hypotheses that you deduce from theories. It is not usually like that with qualitative research because there is something about the researcher's interpretation of the data that is not objective. So we have to be very clear on the subjectivity of doing qualitative research. Now, in terms of applying this, it is very, very clear that quantitative research lends itself to prediction and control of health-related factors in applied settings. So an example would be randomized control trials. Those are very, very, very controlled research using quantitative methods. Whereas for qualitative research, it's really about that interaction with the person, the value consonant function in healthcare setting. You want to understand what this person is doing in the context, and you collect your data in context. So before we move on to the next aspect of our research, I was thinking maybe we could have 50 minutes. Would that be okay? And then over after the break time, we'll come back and then I can tell you more about how to ensure methodological rigor in research, and we can also have more interactions. And then between that time as well, we can take on more questions if it's okay. Dr. Tutu, over to you. Okay. Hi, everyone. So welcome back. I'm just about to start again now for the next segment of our presentation. And if there are any questions that people have so far, by all means, please let me know. Either put them in the chat or you could pass it on to Dr. Tutu, or you can raise your hand. As I am in the presentation mode, I'm not able to see, but by all means, please put them in the chat. I think it might be easier for us to manage if the questions are put in the chat. Okay, thank you. So now, one question that people tend to ask is about rigor. How do you ensure methodological rigor in qualitative research? And what I've done now is to, again, present a comparison table to help people understand that there are credible and comparable approaches in qualitative research to help us ensure rigor and reliability of findings. Now, as many of you may be familiar, especially if you've used quantitative research for a lot of your work, I'm sure you're familiar with criteria such as validity, reliability, objectivity, generalizability, and bias control and data accuracy. And these are all terms that are very consistent with the expectations of quantitative research, whereas it is not the same in qualitative research, but we have a similar and equally appropriate criteria that actually fit and measure the same thing. So when we talk about validity for qualitative research, the term that we use in qualitative research is credibility. So in order to answer your research questions, you want to make sure that your findings are believable and they are trustworthy. Now, how do you ensure credibility in your qualitative research? So oftentimes we do something called member checking. So sometimes researchers will check with the study participants whether what they said was what we've interpreted. So that's how you ensure credibility. Sometimes it is actually not feasible to check in with study participants whether what they said was true, because especially if you are doing a cross-sectional study where you only have contact with participants once, it means that you don't have ethical approval to go back to ask them whether they agree with your findings. So oftentimes we have researchers, if they work as part of a team, or if they can get someone, they can get somebody to look at a cross-section of their data. So for example, maybe about 15% of the data they've collected or 10% of data they've collected, and they have someone who is part of their team, maybe
Sorry, she got logged off, but she's trying to join again. So kindly be patient. Thank you. Please be patient. So just switch laptops. She's trying to email the presentation to me, and then she'll make use of this, my laptop.
Okay. Yeah, my sincere apologies. I am not sure what happened, but I got logged out. So we've just swapped um, laptops now. And so I'm going to continue with what I was saying earlier. So I was talking about methodological rigor in terms of how do we make sure that the data we are collecting and analyzing in our results is consistent and is what we expect it to be, and at the same comparable level with quantitative research. So I mentioned earlier on that many of you will be familiar with the criteria that we use in quantitative research, which is validity, reliability, objectivity, generalizability, bias control, and data accuracy. Now, for qualitative research, we have similar levels of criteria, and the one that is comparable with validity is credibility. So when we talk about validity, we want to ensure that our tools and processes they accurately measure what we want them to measure. So how do we ensure credibility in qualitative research? We actually do what I call what is known as member checking, for example. And so as I explained earlier on, member checking is when you go back to your study participant to find out from them whether what they said was what you've interpreted your findings to mean. Now, if you are doing a cross-sectional qualitative study, in other words, if you have ethical approval to only focus on, to only have contact with your study participant once, then it means that there might be a breach of ethical approval if you have to go back to do member checking. So oftentimes, researchers will work with members or people from their research team to help them check the findings. So sometimes you could have people checking about 10% of the data or 15% of data or even 5% of data collected to make sure that, yes, your findings are in line with what your participants have said. Another way that people check credibility of their findings to ensure that they are believable and trustworthy is triangulation. So many of you might also be familiar with with conducting mixed method research. So sometimes and then you compare to make sure that what you're saying is right, or sometimes to compare your findings with existing literature to also ensure that what you're finding is in accordance with what is expected. These are processes and actions that qualitative researchers undertake to ensure credibility of the findings. The second criteria that I want to point out here is reliability. Again, it's about that consistency and repeatability of results using standardized instruments. In other words, you want to make sure that if I conduct a study using this questionnaire in Elision as an example, then it means that if somebody else, volume is I just remember now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm just making sure that people can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Ma.
Okay, thank you. Right. So the second criteria is reliability. And in reliability, we talk about I think the core component of reliability is the repeatability of results. In other words, if I take a questionnaire and I collect data in Elision and I do the analysis and I report it, somebody taking that questionnaire in Kaduna should be able to repeat and get similar results. So in other words, it's consistent, it's reliable. Now, in qualitative research, because it is very context dependent, we cannot do reliability. Instead, we do dependability. So the equivalent criteria in qualitative research is what is called dependability. And in other words, we want to make sure that if I took your tools to for example, the topic guide to answer the same research question, if I take it to another context, it should be dependable. And how do we ensure dependability in qualitative research? We focus on transparency of the research process. There is an audit trail and there's consistency checks. Now, one of the ways by which we do this is the use of qualitative software in data analysis. Now, I want to make it very clear that we do not use software or processes to analyze the data itself. It helps with the analysis process because the researcher is very, very core to the process of data collection, analysis, and interpretation in qualitative research. And that's why when I talk about the bias control, I will talk more about this. So in terms of dependability here, we say the process has to be transparent, and to ensure transparency, one of the ways we do that is we use software. So for example, NVivo is a software that is used. There's a broad term called that's different software that people can use to, again, ensure transparency of the process. Who did you speak to? How long did you speak to them? Where were they when you spoke to them? What instrument did you use? These are all components of the research process that needs to be very clear, so that sometimes when someone else picks up your rule book or the research book, they know exactly what you do. So it's because they know what you did that they can then say, okay, I can depend on the findings of this research, or I can try and do similar things. So as opposed to quantitative research where we can just repeat the questionnaire, here it's a whole wider process to ensure that transparency. And then, of course, there's audit trail as well. So when we analyze qualitative data and we use software like NVivo, it is actually to help us have an audit trail, because one of the criticism of qualitative research is data cherry picking of data. In other words, you just pick the data you want and say that this is what data said. No, when you use a qualitative software, for example, it helps you to see how you analyze, how you identify your notes, how you identify your teams. That process needs to be followed and properly documented. In recent times, you can actually document your research process using Microsoft Word, or you can even use Excel. The key terms, the processes, all of that could be documented. And if you've applied for research ethics, one of the things that the ethical committee wants to see is the process that you're going to use in implementing your research. And if you've done it, you can easily refer to that as evidence of the dependability of your research, that documents the transparency of the process. The third criteria is objectivity. So obviously, the researcher in quantitative research, the researcher contact is minimized, and it's standardized, and sometimes there's even blinding. So I mentioned earlier on about, randomized control trials. Sometimes these are there's blinding, there's randomization, there is very limited researcher interaction with the process of collecting data. Whereas in qualitative research, we talk about conformability. And the way you confirm, your process there is that you have a reflexive journaling, or another way is that you use direct quotes from what the participants have said to actually confirm your interpretation. So that way you can tell participants that actually you can show your reader that your findings are data-driven, as opposed to you deciding what to say. Because sometimes obviously, because of the subjective nature of qualitative research, there's always that thing about, or maybe you just said it or you just manufactured quotes. But we have to have processes in place to help confirm that our processes, our research is done to the highest level and highest standard. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to have a reflexive journal. So when I say reflexive journal, this is you writing. So I went to this town, I saw this number of people, these children did this. You just reflect. This is how I understood. Even though I was speaking to this one woman, there were several other people around the house and she was checking things and she was distracted. These are the ways you document that process to make it easy to understand and to be able to go back to what you've said. Now, I am going to speak briefly now about generalizability, but I'm going to talk more about that in my last slide for today, because I thought we should spend more time talking about that. Now, one of the things that we have to do and see is that everybody agrees that in quantitative research, statistical generalization is the ultimate goal. You want to be able to say this sample is a reflection of the study population. So if you collect data from I don't know, 300 people that represent a particular study population, you can actually, if you adhere to the principles of statistical analysis as well as your research protocol, you'll be able to generalize your findings to the study population most of the time. Whereas in qualitative research, we cannot generalize. Rather, what we do is what is called transferability. In other words, we have a very thick description that allows readers and people that use our research to determine the relevance of our work to other contexts. Now, something that I need to mention here that I'm also going to talk on when I get to the last slide that I mentioned is the role of qualitative research and its applicability in theory. Again, how do we transfer it? So we want to be able to transfer findings from our research to other contexts, but not generalize it. So it's not about generalization, it's about transferability. Now, in terms of bias control, there's a lot of systems, obviously, for quantitative research. So an example is, like you have random sampling, you have control groups, you have case control groups, and sometimes you even have blinding techniques. So an example of blinding, for example, is in randomized control trials where maybe the researchers don't know the groups that participants have been allocated to, or like you also use different approaches to make sure that the researcher is detached from that study as much as possible. To enhance bias control in qualitative research, we focus on what is called reflexivity and positionality statement. In other words, the researcher upfront says they acknowledge and address their own bias. Yeah. So you're saying to your researchers upfront, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. So for example, in my research, when I work with, so one of the projects that I'm currently working on is looking at working with faith-based organizations, so churches and mosques, to improve the access of African women to breast cancer services. Okay. And so we were upfront, I would say, oh, I'm a Black woman, I am a Christian, and I go to church. And so because of this, I understand already the context, which may affect how the data is interpreted. Whereas in quantitative research, we don't have to do that. So we have to make sure that in qualitative research, we have this reflexivity thing and we have the positionality statement, and we continually check to make sure that what I think they should say is not what I'm hoping that they say. I give them the opportunity to say what they want to say. And I can give an example as well. So from one of my other projects, so for several years ago, I was working on a domestic abuse project, and I adapted my work and adopted the paradigm, the interpretivist paradigm. Now, the interpretivist paradigm, as I mentioned earlier on, says that the context, like knowledge and reality, is socially constructed. So this is a research paradigm, it's a philosophical position that people say the way people talk is based on what happened to them. So in terms of reflexivity and positionality here, I interviewed a woman who told me her experience. So now, for that particular person, she's a Nigerian, and she went with her boyfriend to Italy on holiday. And then when she got to Italy, the boyfriend collected her passport and told her to prostitute. Now, as a Nigerian watching Nollywood growing up, I know that people go to Rome and then they go and prostitute. But as a researcher, I needed to be able to separate what I know from what she said. But having that knowledge of the Nigerian culture of people travel abroad and they go and prostitute was something that helped me to be able to relate to the experience she was actually describing. Now, as she went on with that experience, during the interaction that I had with her as a research participant, there were information that she passed on that if I had not had an idea of the experience of a Nigerian who gets trafficked to prostitute in places like Italy, I would have thought she was making things up. So the reflexivity here actually allowed me to be able to say, I have a knowledge of this. So I'm not dismissing what she's saying as fallacy, because she could have been making it up. But one, she didn't have a reason to make it up. Two, it was within the context of research. So I already have these methodological processes in place to help me to not dismiss what participants are saying as is a lie. It is true because that's based on their experience. And we have the paradigms. Like I said, the organogram I shared earlier on actually helped us to be able to position what people are saying within the framework of research and remove ourselves from that process as much as possible, but also recognizing our individuality and the individuality of the person that is talking within the context of their experience. Now, in terms of data accuracy, this is the last bit about the methodological rigor. Obviously, in qualitative research, data accuracy is measured using validated tools and statistical checks, that advanced statistical software that is used to ensure data accuracy. In qualitative research, we talk more about rich in-context data that is triangulated across methods and sources. So in other words, we would use the literature to confirm or to refute. We would make sure that everything we've done so far is leading to this accuracy as much as possible. So it's not an isolated process. Data accuracy is not something that we just do on its own. Rather, it's all connected. So the credibility, the dependability, the conformability, the transferability, as well as the researcher having a statement to say, this is who I am and this is how I bring my individuality to the research process, all help to create this very clear picture of the context of data as well as the processes to help people to understand what they're doing. Okay. Now, I am going to give an example of a work that I've done to, again, help to make this very clear so that it will not sound too abstract here. And I have put in a few things to help to understand. So the first thing is, if you look at the research question, I started earlier on by saying a research question is something that this is the starting point for you. The research question is the starting point. The research question is the most important thing in research. So I start from there. So I ask myself, what do I want to know? What do I need to know? So that's my question. So I had 3 questions here. What are the barriers to disclosure for domestic abuse among Nigerian women? What factors enable them to seek help? What are the service support for these people? Those are the 3 questions that I need to know. So my research question, what do I need to know? And if you want to take note, you could just copy out the core questions to help you in this process of applying what I've been talking about so far in your own work. So we start with what do I need to know? And then you go to goals, right? Why do I need to know this? So oftentimes that's the objective of your research. Why do I need to know this? So in the context of this example I'm giving you, I want to help improve domestic abuse service provision and utilization by Nigerian women. So that's why I need to know this. Why I need to know. I'm still talking about the worked example. So can you see my screen? I'm talking about the worked example of using the domestic abuse research worked example. Is that the slide you can see? Dr. Tutu, can you hear me? I don't know if, but okay, thank you. Yes, okay, thank you. I have chatting to say yes, they can see the slide. Okay, so like I said, we start with the research question. What do I need to know? And then we go to the goals. Why do I need to know this? Which would be the research objects. Like, what's the ultimate goal of why I am doing this? Okay, and then the next thing we talk about is what kind of data and analysis. Now, before we go to the methods, let's go back to the conceptual framework. So we call this conceptual framework, and it could be anything you want to describe it. Another way to talk about it is the philosophical position, the paradigms that I mentioned earlier on about, how do I know what I know? So how do I know that what this person is telling me is the truth? And in more technical terms, it is where we talked about the epistemological positions, the ontological positions, the truth, the paradigms, the interpretivity, the paradigm is, how do I know what I know? How do I know that these people are telling me the truth? How do I know that they are not lying to me? So once you have your research questions, you know what I need to know. And why do I need to know this? Then the next question you ask yourself is, how did I know what I know? How do I know that what they are telling me is true? So like I said, I give an example of my own background as a Nigerian. And then in the context of the triangulation, there are theories of domestic violence within the African context that I can use to support what I know. And then there's a narrative literature, again, that I have done that I can use to support what I know. So that's how I come to the knowledge of what I know already. Yeah, so it's not that I just decided that this is what's going to happen. Rather, we have the literature to support, we have theories to support, and then, of course, as a qualitative researcher, you have your own background to consider in the context. So, for example, an example of a qualitative research might be, why do women choose to not breastfeed their babies? So somebody who had a personal experience of challenges of not breastfeeding, for example, might want to do a research on that, or they may choose to not do a research on that. They may just choose to be familiar with it as an example. Now, it could be, that's why you talk about, why do I need to know this? So in my context, I wanted to help improve domestic violence services for women, because based on existing evidence, there was problem with utilization of services. And some people, it could be that they want to develop processes to help young mothers, lactating mothers, deal with the challenges of breastfeeding. Because within the context of all women must breastfeed, it's cheaper, it's better, it's best. There is that feeling of women who can breastfeed that has been, they have a feeling of, oh, I'm not a good mother because I did not breastfeed my kids. But if there's research explaining and understanding why it could be challenging for women to breastfeed, and say midwives and healthcare workers are aware of this, they could help these women to do the best they can in that context. So that's another example of how you can translate what do I need to know? Why do I need to know it? How did I know that what I know is what I know? Now, if by the time you have your goals ready, then you want to go to the methods. And in terms of methods, the question you're asking yourself is, what kind of data and analysis method will answer the research questions? So again, that's a very simple way for you to be able to conceptualize your study, right? And for example, in the example I'm giving you, I use semi-structured, in-depth individual interviews. And tomorrow, depending on how much time we have, we can talk more about the process of developing the different types of interview methods. We can focus more on data collection and analysis tomorrow. But in terms of semi-structured, we have a guide that guides the conversation. It's not just off tangent, talking to my friend. We have a focus and we keep to that focus, and we help people to stay within the structure of that. It's just that it's not rigid. It's semi-structured in that you have questions and people can say, oh yeah, I don't really understand why this, I remember when this person from our community did this. They could go off on a tangent, but you're able to bring them back because you have a structure and it's semi-structured. And then it's in-depth. So it's not just one word answer, unlike quantitative data collection, for example, where oftentimes you're just collecting the yes, no, maybe responses. Here, it's more in-depth. Somebody says to you, I'm not really sure what happened last week. You want to ask more questions. You want to go in depth. You want to probe more. And again, within the context of research, that is acceptable. Now, I have put in here that in the example I'm giving you, I have done inductive individual interviews. So this is not like group interview or case studies or family. And so because there are times when you want to do interviews with a family member and maybe a lactating mom and their partner, their husband, or maybe the mom, the young parent, and the mother-in-law, the grandmother, or a family. It's not really the focus group of 10, 7, 9 people. It's just a smaller group of 2, 3 people. So there are different ways of collecting data depending on what you've decided to do that will answer your question. But in my case, in the example I'm giving you, it was really about the individual interviews. And then in terms of analyzing the semi-structured interviews, I used what is called inductive latent thematic analysis. In other words, I allowed the data to tell me what they were saying in order to answer my questions. So I'm not doing a deductive analysis to say, this is what I want it to be. So if you remember from my earlier slide today, I did talk about the structure to be inductive, and this is where it's come out now, because the the thematic analysis was not just looking at what they've said and took it on face value. We had to go through the process of checking each of the data to make sure that it's actually from the data that we find the answers to these questions. Now, I have put in here ensuring rigor. Again, what processes are in place to guide the study? That's the question you want to ask. So you want to do your qualitative research. These are very core one. So these are 5 core things you want to bear in mind. So, and the 5th question here is, what processes are in place to guide the study? So from the word go, you have your research question. You want to establish your methodological criteria. How will I know what I know? And in my case, I had monthly meetings with my superiors. And then, of course, I also used somebody who was not part of the research to actually be able to come back and tell me, okay, this is good, this is not good, could be different. Now, remember that I did a cross-sectional qualitative study, so I could not go back to the study participant because one, the subject area was very difficult, and it was very hidden. It was a very hidden sample, so there was no way I would have been able to get the same set of people again. So we needed to use someone else to help with this check-in to ensure that there's rigor in our study. So let's go back. Now, this is my final slide because I would like us to have enough times for questions and comment. And I want to end with this question. What about the generalization of findings? So everyone talks about qualitative research. When you say, oh, I'm doing qualitative research, the first thing you hear is, oh, but your findings are not generalizable. And it's like, through that lens of generalizability, everything kind of like falls away. Oh, we can't do qualitative research because the findings are not generalizable. So in qualitative research, statistical generalization is not the primary goal. So instead of aiming to apply findings broadly to large populations, the focus is always on depth, context, and meaning. And for some of you that conduct mixed method research, you would understand what I'm saying. So sometimes you need to collect the quantitative data, but oftentimes you also need to have the context so that you can have the context explaining and adding more value to the data you've collected. Now, although we do not aim for statistical generalization, it doesn't mean actually that our data is not useful beyond the context. It actually means that we are able to do more with that data. Now, the key thing in qualitative research is theoretical generalization. Okay, so that's a very key distinction you have to bear in mind. So for quantitative research, the focus is statistical generalization. However, in qualitative research, it is theoretical generalization. In other words, we use the findings to illuminate or refine theory. Okay, so I can give you an example in my work. So when in the context of the domestic abuse research I mentioned earlier on, so when we got the findings, so there were 3 findings from the study in terms of factors influencing the disclosure and help-seeking practices of Nigerian women when they experience domestic abuse. And the first was their socialization, so the way they were raised within the Nigerian community, the immigration status they had in the UK, and the way their acculturation in the country, who they know, where they go to, who they associate with. In order for us to be able to contextualize that data, I use the Nigerian feminist perspective to interpret that data. So basically, the findings from my research was able to help refine the Nigerian feminist perspective on the role of women and how that affects their help-seeking practices and how that affects who they will go to for help and how they will seek help. So while I'm not talking about generalizing findings from my research, I'm able to say, based on these established theoretical position, this findings is able to help us refine it, clarify it, make it make sense so that we are able to know what to do and how to take it forward. And that's the beautiful thing about qualitative research. We are not aiming for generalization, because sometimes even when you want to make a generalization, there are still factors that you need to be controlled for that you can't control for. But because you're aligning your findings with an established theory, you're able to actually be very specific in that context because the theory already exists and you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So the strength of qualitative research actually lies not in predicting outcomes, but in developing nuanced understandings that contribute to conceptual and theoretical advancement. So we already know. So for example, I didn't invent or start the Nigerian feminist perspective. It wasn't, the Nigerian feminist story was not started by me. It's been in existence for several years. We have so many of the scholars that developed it in the late 80s and early 90s. But what has happened is that my findings have been able to help us understand that theory in a different context. So even though my study participants were living in the UK, we were able to use the Nigerian feminist perspective to improve our understanding of things for those women in the context where they live, but it's still because they had the Nigerian upbringing. And an example of what has happened, for example, is this. So one of the things that came out of our findings was that people would go to church when they experience domestic abuse. They would ask for prayers for the pastor, they would speak to the elders, and that's what they do. Now, that's what they do as well in the UK, even though they live in the UK and they don't live in Nigeria. So they still go to church. Now, because we're able to attach that, find that nuanced understanding to an existing theory, it makes sense then that when policies are being formulated and services are being developed, there is a very, very clear focus on engaging faith-based organizations and churches and mosques and temples, because we have an existing theoretical understanding that says, yes, the socialization of women from their country of origin would affect how they seek help. So we have the socio-ecological model that tells us there are different layers. And this finding is now coming to say, look, in the context of these women, these qualitative research findings align with this theoretical position, and then it can be used to improve the services of these women. And if I want to go back, it takes me back to the goal of my research, where I've been able to say, we need to be able to improve the services for these women. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to answer these questions. And that theory helped me to be able to come back to this goal. So I think that's the end of my presentation. And we have about 30 minutes now for questions, and then I can provide answers. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, it's very good. Okay, Dr. Tutu, please, any question? Oh, they can't see. It's back in the light. How do you increase the screen? Oh, actually, I can go back on my screen once I finished. Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know why the brightness is but I'll see if I can get back on my laptop, which I think is a bit better.
Recording in progress.
Hello, Tutu, are you there? Hello? Hello? Okay. Anyway, I'll try and check the chat to see questions.
Professor Tayoma,
Yes, please.
the RIIC people are not online. I think they lost their connection. So,
Okay. I'm
So-
just trying to check if there are questions on the chat. We are not together, so we don't know what happened. I'm trying to go over the chat and see.
So there is a question I just came up, but I don't know if I can.
Yes, please go
Okay, you
ahead.
need to mute yourself and reduce your volume to
Okay.
100. I put it at 100, so you need to reduce it back to
Okay.
0.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a minute.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Oh, I need to.
Good morning. Dr. Malade, we would like to appreciate you for that wonderful
Dr. Jimo, please, can you
presentation.
help unmute Dr.
Dr.
Alex?
Abib is out at the moment, so I'm going to
Tutu is not there.
assist her in coordinating this section, question and answer
Dr.
section.
Jimo, please.
So please, participants, thank you for your time. We would like to welcome your comments, contributions, and questions. Kindly drop them in the chat. I'm not able to unmute anyone at the moment. Okay, we have one hand raised.
So there's a question.
Let me see if I can unmute.
There's a question already in the chat.
Okay.
They can't unmute me.
Okay, please go ahead and ask your question. Chibuese Ogbonna is raising hand. Please go ahead and ask your question. Can they hear me? I don't understand.
I thought they were supposed to type the questions in the chat box.
Please. Okay, we have one. I'm going to address that. Please keep putting in your questions in there. We have a response from Inioluwa Ogunsheye. Inioluwa Ogunsheye, thank you for your wonderful presentation, Ma. How does one ensure rigor in terrorism-related research? How does one ensure rigor in terrorism-related research? That's our number one question. Should we go ahead and take all, or we answer them as they come?
I would like to answer the question one at a time.
All right, Ma.
So that we can so that it's very specific, because I see that the questions are very different to each person. So the first question about ensuring rigor in terrorism-related research is exactly the same principle that I've shared. So in terms of ensuring rigor, it starts from the beginning of your question. It starts from the beginning of your question. How do you make sure Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So in terms of ensuring rigor in terrorism-related research is exactly the same principle of ensuring rigor in research, okay? What is different here is your research question. So if you're looking at terrorism-related research, it means that your research question is going to be very specific to terrorism-related topics. But the principle of research in terms of rigor is also going to be dependent on how you want to answer that question. So if there is enough data in the area, there's enough quantitative data to say this is what the problem is, you want to do a large-scale study, then maybe you realize that actually the method and the approach to answer your question may be more inclined towards quantitative methods, then you can go down that road. However, if you realize that actually there's not enough work done in this area, we don't have enough research, and the best thing to do is to start small, then you may lend yourself towards qualitative research, because oftentimes qualitative research helps us to begin to establish the research in a particular area. So if terrorism-related research, for example, does not have enough existing evidence in that area, you can start with qualitative research. And in doing qualitative research, then you can apply the same principles that we've talked about in terms of rigor. And if you refer to the presentation I shared on the slide that I shared on where we have the differences, These are the things you need to do to make sure that you're documenting what you want to do. Your protocol is very strong. You have enough, the team. You're also doing what you can to make sure that your data is collected appropriately, and you do member checking as you go along. Thank you. Does that answer your question at least?
Thank you very much, Ma.
I see a question here about.
Yes, there are two
So
questions.
there's one before that one. So there is a question about should every qualitative research illuminate or refine a theory, and how important is this? No, every qualitative research should not refine a theory. Every qualitative research should not illuminate a theory. However, in terms of the question you're asking, why are you asking that question? What do you want to get out of it? If you just want to establish that, yes, there's a problem, I don't understand what is going on here, then you can just answer the question and just stop there and take it forward. So I gave an example of mine because I needed the goal for me was to be able to explain the findings of my research in a way that would obviously be comparable with somebody using a quantitative research approach, which was why I aligned it with theory refinement and theory elimination. However, it is not always the case that that's what you want to do. Again, it goes back to your research question and why you want to know what you know. And I have to also say that it is not all quantitative research that is also generalizable. Sometimes you just want to establish the baseline of what the situation is. So that's something that you can also bear in mind. So, but ultimately, I think every research should address a societal problem. And for you to be able to want to address a societal problem, I definitely recommend making sure that you have theoretical alignment, refinement and applicability and transferability as part of your study setup. I hope that's helpful. So I have answered the question about terrorism-related research. Yes. Oh, there's someone else. Chibo Ezebona is saying that he's also asked an earlier question. I don't know if.
Yes, thank you, Ma, for an excellent presentation. Could you please relate the presentation to a typical science example, say IT?
Typical science example. So again, it goes back to the research question. What exactly would you like to find out about IT? So in terms of research, I guess maybe one of the things that I could focus on tomorrow is how to formulate a research question. Perhaps that might be a good place to start. And then that would help you to be able to work out what you want, because it's not just IT as it is really about that thing in IT. What do you want to find out? So that's where we start from. What is a research question? Because it's that research question that would then take you in the direction that you need to travel in terms of the methods you want to approach. So it is really about that research question. So it's not just what is IT. I don't know specific examples. So why do software act? Do they communicate with each other? IT is not my field. Okay, so if your question is why do people use a particular software, then that's a very good question, because you can then determine whether you want to do qualitative research to answer that question. And then we can look at, what are the types, like I did in my presentation where I gave you the 5 questions of what do I want to know? Why do I want to know this? How do I know what I know is right? What methods will help me to answer this question? And how do I ensure rigor in this question? So those are the 5 questions that you could use to help you to answer that specific IT-related question. But you have to be very clear on what you want that question to be. Okay.
I have one question here.
Okay.
There are different
One of the participants.
Whether
That is
should have only one objective or more.
regarding flexibility.
So
okay.
Again, we go back to research question. So you determine whether your research question should have 1 or 2 objectives or more. Now, in my case, in my research, most of my research project, I typically have 3 objectives. So there is an overarching aim of what we call goal. Where do I need to get to? Why am I doing this? The goal in the example I gave was to improve access for women, if they experience domestic abuse. That was the overarching goal. But that wasn't just the goal. So in that study, there were 3 objectives. and each objective had a corresponding research question. So I didn't have just one research question or just one objective. I had 3 different research questions and 3 different objectives, and each of those were answered appropriately. So again, it depends on what you want to find out and what you want to. So if you know that, okay, I can't just answer my question with one question, you can have 3 questions. The rule of thumb is to have 3 or 4 or as many, but depending on how big your question is. Sometimes if you think you're going to have more than 4 questions, the recommendation is to break it down and try to simplify the research to, I don't know, 2 or 3, but as a rule of thumb, I tend to go for 3 questions. So I think I missed one about so how do you control for respondents' subjectivity bias in research, in qualitative research? Now, here, in qualitative research, we don't control for bias, okay? Instead, what we do is what is called positionality of the researchers. So in my presentation, when I talked about bias control under methodological rigor, I talked about reflexivity and positionality statement. So you have to say to yourself, as part of your paradigms, as part of the design of your study, that you have to believe that the respondents are telling you what they are telling you. So I gave you, and that's within the context of the research study. And you also have to believe that people are not choosing to lie for the sake of it. Now, sometimes they could be lying, but because in qualitative research, you are looking into in-depth thematic analysis as opposed to the individual subject responses, oftentimes when you have your rigorous data analysis process and data interpretation process, you're almost likely going to be able to make sure that one outlier finding does not actually overshadow what everyone is saying. So if a respondent is biased and they are not really telling you the truth, it doesn't stand out because you're not just looking at that one case study. You're combining all of the data as part of the research project itself. So basically, you say something like, as part of your positionality statement, you also need to recognize that participants may not tell you the truth and they might be biased, and that's absolutely fine because you recognize that, but you do not just select that respondent, you combine them with the rest of the data you're collecting. Okay. Is there a need for specific objectives in qualitative research? The answer is yes. There is need for specific objectives. Yes, you have to have. You can go. If you think of research as a process of getting from point A to point B, there is no way you can get to a point where if you don't know where you are going. So if you think of your research objective as the roadmap for your destination to get you to that goal of what you need to know, so you need to have research objective as part of qualitative research. Yes. Can you? Okay, so research questions are the beginning of the process for you to be able to design a research study, find your approach, the study design, the paradigm. You want to make sure that you have a question. Now, in terms of research question, you don't need to have just one research question. You can have as many as you like. However, the caveat here is it needs to be appropriate to what you want to find out. So in my research, for example, I tend to have 3 research questions. I have one overarching aim, so one goal, but then I have 3 research questions, and then I have 3 objectives to answer each of those questions. So the research question is the beginning of the journey. If you have a research question, that research question will determine the method you use in answering the question. Do you want to use quantitative data or do you want to use qualitative data? And oftentimes you still have to do literature review to find out what already exists in the literature, what the gaps are, as you define your research question. Can you do more than one? Yes, you can have more than one question in, yes, I have just answered that. So, okay. Any
There are
more questions?
There are more questions in here, Ma. So from the YouTube channel. My question, okay, regarding
Another question?
flexibility.
Okay, there's one here.
This is from
If
one of the
qualitative
respondents.
research is usually employed when little is known about the area of study, how do you reconcile finding empirical studies for such a study?
So oftentimes we will do a literature review to start any research project. So if there's little that is known about that particular subject, the first point of call is to do a literature review. So as an example, so when I did my study looking at domestic abuse among Nigerian women in the UK, there was a lot of research already on domestic abuse against women. So we had existing empirical studies. There were, theories that have already been done. So we had enough empirical studies that already told us that women experience domestic abuse. In fact, depending on the country, because if you think of all the work that has been done across the African continent, across North America and Asia and Europe, there is enough evidence to say that the experiences of women is different depending on where they find themselves and their ethnic origin and things like that. What we didn't have, though, was the specific experience of certain ethnic minority groups. So there was enough research that has been done about domestic abuse among South Asian women in the UK, for example, but there were also empirical studies that had used qualitative research in the past, and this has been supported with, mixed method approach, quantitative data in some instances. And so what then happens is this process of triangulation comes in because, one, in terms of the specific experience of Nigerian women, there has not been a work done on that at that point. There was very little known outside of the general, if you are not a white British woman, your experience is different. So we needed to go into that, but we also needed to reconcile our findings with existing literature. And I think that is how you can do it. So how you can reconcile findings from empirical studies for such a small study where nothing is known is to use existing literature in that space, that field, to support what you want to do. So when you start with your literature review saying, this is what is already known here, and this is what the gap is, and this is this gap that I want to address. And then when you do your findings, your discussion would go back to align with literature to say, yes, based on what they've said, this is true. However, this is the additional thing that we found based on this new study. Yeah.
How do you determine the most appropriate philosophical framework in qualitative research?
So in terms of the philosophical framework, this is a bit tricky in that people need to, as a researcher, you have to know what you're doing. So the school of thought in terms of philosophical framework is very extensive. Now, if you think of it, everything is in a continuum. So you have on the extreme left is a positivist paradigm where it says it's very objective, is yes or no. There's no shade of gray anywhere. It's black or white. And then on the other extreme is the interpretivist paradigm that says it's very subjective. It is what you tell me. I don't have any other idea beyond what you say to me. Now, some people don't use that extreme one. So I use the interpretivist paradigm in my work because I said to myself, the context of people are very specific to their experience. However, there are different schools of thought. So the best way to determine the most appropriate philosophical framework actually is to read about them and to find questions or research that have used the framework you're interested in to answer the question that may be similar to yours. So an example here is that in the subject of domestic abuse, within the framework that I am working in, most of the research have used interpretivism framework. So it was very easy for me to actually use interpretivism framework because I was also trying to position my work within the existing research framework. So another example of a philosophical framework that you could use, for example, is social constructivism. So if you think that, okay, social constructivism is more realistic or more appropriate for my work, then you can use it. There is, of course, the pragmatism school of thought. That's another framework that you could use in your research. But the way to determine, I think the simple way to determine is to check what the existing literature is with respect to your field, find out what paradigms researchers, more established researchers in your field are using, and then use that to align your work, because ultimately you want to contribute to that field. Your research question will be contributing to existing evidence in that field. Okay. Yes, yes, exactly. So again, you have to also recognize as part of yourself that you have a position here. How do you see things? You know, what's your view? How does it align with yourself? And that also will go into, you know, the philosophical framework that you will adopt as a researcher. Now, the next question is, you keep using the word triangulation in research, in qualitative research. What does it mean? So I am not using the word triangulation in qualitative research. What I've tried to explain is that sometimes when you want to establish methodological rigor, sometimes you want to compare. Okay, so triangulation here, for example, would be you have a finding, right? And then you want to say, okay, does it make sense? So in terms of ensuring credibility, dependability, and conformability in qualitative research, sometimes you want to compare your findings. So it is not really a qualitative research word in terms of triangulation. Is the fact that you want to make sure that these findings are comparable and they are doing what you want them to do. So specifically, it is in response to credibility. So you want to make sure that the findings from your research is credible and is believable and is trustworthy. And to do that, you want to make sure that it's not just you saying what you're saying. So if you think of how to apply the principle of triangulation in qualitative research, the ultimate aim here will be to ensure the credibility of your findings. And sometimes it means that you're asking your study participant to check that what you've said is correct, or you're asking your superiors or your teammates or your project colleagues to check that what you've said is correct, or sometimes you use the literature to confirm what you've said. So it is actually to ensure credibility in the methodological rigor in qualitative research. That's how it lends itself. But like I said, the principle of triangulation is not a specific thing to any research paradigm. How can we strike the balance in generalization of findings between qualitative, the same subject of the study?
Just a minute. Please, Mr. David Ogundele, you can please send us the chart. We can see your hand, please. If you have a question, just send it to the chat.
So how can we strike the balances in generalization of findings between qualitative and quantitative research on the same subject of study? Now, as I mentioned again in the methodological rigor slide, in qualitative research, we do not talk about generalizability. So to answer your question, I'm not sure how we can strike a balance because qualitative research does not lend itself to generalization. Instead, we talk about transferability. In other words, we want to be able to transfer the findings from our small study to another study. So if you're using a mixed method approach, then the term in this context will not be generalizability because you're not really trying to generalize. You're more trying to establish what is being said to make sure that the findings lends itself to what actually aligns and is applicable. So in context, you cannot strike a balance in generalizability in qualitative research because we cannot generalize findings from qualitative research. What we can do is to transfer that findings, and the best way to do the transferability is to align it with the theoretical position. So the next question that I can see here is, can qualitative research be used to carry out an intervention research? What are the possible challenges? I would need to know more about the context of this intervention research to be able to provide an answer to this question. But like every research question, there will be challenges when you want to do an intervention research. So by the intervention research, are you suggesting that you already you've collected your data, you've developed the processes, you've created an intervention, you then want to evaluate? Are you trying to evaluate the intervention? Are you trying to implement the intervention? Are you trying to check the acceptability of the intervention, the feasibility of intervention, the utility of intervention? What exactly are you looking to do in that intervention research? It is what you're trying to do that will determine whether you can use qualitative research method in that study. And when you want to do an intervention research, there's a lot of moving parts in that type of research. So it's not just qualitative research. Sometimes you could use different things. So for example, I was involved in a project that was it was an intervention. So we developed a particular way of helping healthcare professionals to support adult patients. We wanted to evaluate within the context of a cluster randomized controlled trial, whether that intervention that we've developed works. Now, because it is a cluster randomized controlled trial, we had to use a mixed method approach. So we used quantitative method to collect some of the data, and then we had a nested qualitative study to evaluate and find out the acceptability of the interventions and some of these other things. So in terms of intervention research, there are several moving parts, but oftentimes it may need to be a mixed method study. Okay. Can you use more than one theory? Can you use more than one research theory or framework? Yes, absolutely. You can use more than one research theory. You just need to ask yourself why. In research, there's a lot of why questions. Why do I want to do this? Why am I doing this? And oftentimes, you realize that if you do extensive reading, you realize that there's already one framework or one theoretical position that actually answers your question. You don't need to combine two, because if you have two separate theoretical positions, they have their own assumptions and school of thought that could be competing. And sometimes it's just very confusing to take part A of theory 1 and part C of theory 2. But oftentimes, because it is research, chances are somebody had already developed a paradigm or a theoretical position that actually captures all the moving parts of your own research. It's just that you need to do a lot of extensive literature review to find out what already exists to help you with that. Okay. Yes, I'm reading that one, yes. The fact that qualitative research is subjective, this has brought about the believability within the context of scientific research process and are led to roadblock in commonality of adoption of the same. However, the use of software like NVivo can bring about believability. Shouldn't we focus on the use of this software than manually carrying out this qualitative data gathering and analysis? So going back to my slide on methodological rigor, I talked about dependability. Okay. So dependability is another word. It's the technical term we use is dependability. But of course, the principle of your research findings being dependable also applies here in terms of it being believable. Okay. Now, we can't just use qualitative software to do analysis. We can't just, I'm not saying we cannot, we can't just. I use NVivo in my work. And the principle of this dependability here is about the transparency of the research process, the audit trails, and the consistency of checks, okay? So if you can manually have a process that documents your transparency, that documents the audit trail of your analysis, and people can randomly do a consistently check, it is fine. I use NVivo in my work because it's easier to manage, but ultimately the analysis of the data, the interpretation of that data is still down to the researcher. Okay, so using software like NVivo, Atlas T, or even basic Excel to do your framework analysis, for example, is good because then you have a digital form of your audit trail that somebody can put up. And back in the day, people used to do it manually where they write on Post-it note and textbook and things like that. That process is still valid as long as you can demonstrate it. Somebody asks you, can you walk me through the process of your research? If you have your written thing manually, you can use it. But if you have it digitally as well, you can use it. As long as we are not replacing software with the work that the researcher is supposed to do, I think it's fine. It's the same thing with SPSS, for example, for qualitative research. Even though you're entering your volume of data, your numbers into it, the interpretation ultimately lies with the researcher. Even though numbers don't lie, right, in statistics, but you have to make sure that the researcher are already interpreting the whole process regularly and rightly. So using the software alone does not make your research believable or dependable. It's the whole process that you have to be able to demonstrate. Okay. How do you analyze focus group discussion? So an example of the way we can analyze focus group discussion is thematic analysis. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk a bit more about the different approaches to qualitative data analysis, and it could be used across all forms of data collection processes. However, I'm just going to mention it. I'm not going to be able to go into detail, but you can actually check up and read up online on the process, but it's still about the same approach to analyzing any form of data, any form of qualitative data. It's going to be the same process. The next question I have here is, can qualitative research be conducted to test cost and effect relationship? The answer is no. It cannot be used to test cost and effect. Yes, thank you. So there's a question here. I think the essential of mixed method approach such as convergent is to strengthen generalization of findings theoretically or empirically. Or what is your view on this, Ma? So I do not conduct mixed method research. My expertise is in qualitative research. And so I'm not able to lend my professional expertise to comment on the strengthening of generalization theoretically and empirically with respect to mixed method study. However, what I can tell you is that I have been part of projects where they've used mixed method research, but as part of that project, I bring my qualitative expertise into it, and I just focus on that aspect of my work as part of the RIIC team. But I have current PhD students and colleagues that use pragmatic approach. So they use the theoretical framework they use is pragmatism. And one of the things that is very clear is that when they do the analysis and the interpretation of their findings, the goal oftentimes is not generalization. We need to be very clear that we are not, because even when you want to generalize, on what basis are you generalizing? Have you controlled for all the, what approaches have you used to analyze your data? How much sample did you have? What sort of this population are you using? Do you have your cause effect intact? Do you have your control variables in? And these are all questions that you need to answer to be able to make a generalization. So again, it's very likely, but like I said, it is not within my area of expertise, so I'm not able to share a view on this. Okay. I'm conscious of the fact that we are 5 minutes past the allotted time, but obviously we have a few hiccups here and there. So any more, maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we finish?
Yes, Ma. We have 2 questions from the YouTube.
Okay.
Let me quickly read it out here. Regarding flexibility, does the narrative from one experience needs to be provided when you send in manuscript for publication? Should I read that again, ma'am?
So thank you very much for the question. So there is a question here from YouTube that says, regarding reflexivity, does the narrative from one's experience need to be provided when you send in a manuscript for publication? My understanding of that is, are you asking for the reflexivity of the researcher? Yeah? Your positionality statement. If the answer is yes, then yes, you have to send in your positionality statement in your research. It's almost like it's part of the methodology. It's part of how you establish rigor. So every time you publish, if you look up work on qualitative research, for example, if you think of some of the publications that have been done that have used purely qualitative research, you are going to find a reflexivity statement there or positionality of the researcher. And so it's almost an expected thing now that as part of your manuscript publication, you need to include a statement of researcher reflexivity. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ma. I hope that answers your questions. The second one, do we have to use all the rigor method?
So what about testing the impact of one variable on another? Can one use qualitative approach? No, you cannot use qualitative approach to test variables because variable is a quantitative measure. It is not a qualitative measure. So you cannot test a variable in qualitative research.
Please, Ma, Dr. Abi, you can read the other question from your end. So I can.
Well, my Okay, so can I just read out the question? So there is a question from YouTube saying that do we use all the rigor method, so the credibility, dependability, etc., and what would be considered sufficient to prove rigor? My answer to that would be yes, because ultimately it is all connected. So while you're not dropping the word credibility, dependability, conformability, transferability as part of your work, you are making sure that it is reflected, it is communicated clearly. So by everything you do, because really your findings, when you talk about how data was collected, how you ensure that your data was appropriately collected, there's something there that you mentioned that shows that your findings were credible. When you talk about the transparency of your research process or how you analyze your data was analyzed using NVivo software, or the researcher kept detailed record of the process of audit trail, that is you showing dependability, even though you have not actually discussed that. There's also the thing about conformability. And so when you use quotes in your findings and your publication, yes, you're showing that you can confirm the findings, that you didn't just pluck out the findings from space. And when you talk about transferability, for example, even when you say to yourself, when you write, oh, the findings are not generalizable, they are not generalizable. However, I have used this theoretical approach to explain my findings. That is you adopting the principle of transferability. And then, of course, there's the question of reflexivity and positionality statement, which again, as I mentioned in the previous response, you have to answer, and it is very clear that yes, you have done it. So as I've explained, everything, all this rigor is embedded in the research process, is embedded in your writing, is embedded in your reporting. So yes.
So thank you very much for the response.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions I have. If there's any more final question?
Yes, ma. There's one final question
before
here.
I pass on back to the RIIC team.
I don't know if she can hear me. I don't understand.
Okay. Dr. Tutu, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Omolade. We really appreciate your insightful and, timely presentation on qualitative data. We have been reminded of few things that we know before, and we have also
any other question?
Learned we have also learned new lessons from you.
Any other question, please?
You can't hear me. I'm not muted, but
can the video be sent to participant, ma? Yes, please.
Can't hear.
We'll do that.
Where is Dr.
Ms. Obadimeji, are you there?
Can you hear me, ma?
Well, I think my team in RIIC, probably they have been logged out. So I want to thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. Thank you for all the questions. And on behalf of RIIC, I want to appreciate Dr. Omolade Allen for a wonderful presentation, and thank you for providing answers to our questions. Please, we hope to continue the same time tomorrow, 10 o'clock, and hope to see you there. Yes, you will have the video. You will have the video. I can see others asking, please, Ma, can we have the video? It will be sent to you. Thank you very much. So have a wonderful afternoon, and the slides too. Yes, thank you very much. You're welcome. Thank you. You'll receive the video recording. You will. Thank you. Have a great afternoon and see you tomorrow. Bye.